matters now. It's great. Best thing I've seen them do. Hi everybody, we're going to begin in just a second now. We're really excited to have everybody here on this sunny day, and unless I'm really very tired, it seems slightly cooler now than earlier in the day. Okay, there's a little bit of a breeze, it seems pretty good. We're very excited to have Sarah Schulman back with us. We had her here, of course, when the hardback edition of Let the Record Show came out, and now we have this beautiful paperback edition, which has been selling very briskly. And of course, she's coming off of the fabulous success of The Lady Hamlet at the Provincetown Theater, and we have one of the wonderful actors here with us who's just sitting back there, and we're really excited about that. It was fantastic. I got to see it twice, so I was really thrilled about it. And she may or may not tell us about future projects. I don't know if she will, the other plays that are coming up. But we have plenty of copies of the book in the store for you, both in the store here on Commercial Street and at the Fine Arts Work Center annex that we have over there. So they're in both locations. As always, if you want a copy signed, how much longer are you going to be in town?
I can come by and sign copies.
Okay,
yeah.
She'll come by and sign copies. So that's fantastic. So Let the Record Show, Political History of ACT UP New York, 1987 to 1993, an incredible book. So thrilled to have Sarah Schulman back here. And I want to wish you a very happy birthday. Today is Sarah's birthday, and she's here with us. So
64.
looking marvelous.
All right.
And now Sarah Schulman.
Oh, thank you. How many people here were in an ACT UP somewhere? All right. So jump in with whatever you want to say. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about the world of the book and then open it up for whatever contributions you want to make or questions that you have. So basically, we now know that AIDS is about 100 years old, and the first sign of it in the United States is in the 1940s. There was a group of sailors who had a rare lung disease, and the doctor saved the lung cells. And during AIDS, when AIDS was recognized, they looked back and it was pneumocystis pneumonia. So that was 1940s. In the 60s and 70s, in New York City, people who worked with homeless people report that there was vocabulary around AIDS symptoms in the 60s and 70s. So there was something called junkie pneumonia, which we now know is pneumocystis. There was something called the dropsies, which is wasting syndrome. So it was prevalent enough in the underclass that there was actually vocabulary for it. And yet science did not notice the pattern that came to be known as AIDS until 1981. And this is because of the failure of our healthcare system. So the first public announcement was July 3rd, 1981 in the New York Times. And the famous headline that we all know, 41 cases of rare cancer found among homosexuals. But I want to contextualize for you what that headline actually meant in 1981. So today we have this category, white gay man, that's often used as a privileged category, whether you think it should be or not. But in 1981, gay men were a profoundly oppressed minority. Gay sex was illegal. In fact, sodomy laws were not overturned until 2003. Even in New York City, there was no protection for housing. You could be kicked out of your apartment, you could be fired from a job, you could be denied public accommodation, service in a restaurant or hotel. Familial homophobia was the cultural norm and was virulent. And street violence by both the police and straight people against gay people was a kind of form of public entertainment known as gay bashing, and there was no one to turn to. So we're talking about a very oppressed minority that really had no rights. And because of the stigma around homosexuality at the time, and let me just contextualize that, today we know that sexuality and gender are different in each person and can change over your lifetime. But at that time, that was not understood. And the belief was that everyone was born straight and cis, and then something went wrong, the perversion, and then you became homosexual, which was one thing. And it had a cause, and the society was obsessed with finding this cause. If something is not stigmatized, nobody looks for the cause. Nobody is asking, why do people like sports? right, or something like that. But the big theories in 1980, early 80s, were pseudoscience around biological causes of homosexuality. And for those of you who are my age, you probably remember the hypothalamus theory, that it was, tied to your hypothalamus. I mean, it's absurd now. But so when the New York Times said 41 cases of rare cancer, what a lot of people interpreted that to mean was the inherent biological disease of homosexuality itself was being expressed. And we see this in the early vocabulary that evolved. So the first name for the disease was GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. And then there was the term gay cancer. Now, there's no such thing as gay-related immune deficiency because there's no biomarker for queerness. This has never been shown. There's no such thing as gay cancer. Cancer cannot be gay. But this was the idea at the time. And from the beginning, AIDS has been misrepresented up until the present. So historicizing it has always been a struggle. Now, I became a reporter for the Gay and Lesbian and Feminist Press in 1979 when I was 21. And at that point, I'm looking at you, Bill, because you're also a veteran of the gay press. Every city had feminist newspapers and gay and lesbian newspapers. Some had more than one. And there was this whole gang of us reporters who were out there. We didn't get paid, and we were trying to identify what the issues were for our community and write about it for the community. When I started in 79, that was a key year because that's the year of the Hyde Amendment. So abortion became legal in 73, but in 79, Medicaid funding for abortion was taken away by the Hyde Amendment, and only 7 states after that paid for Medicaid. So really, we only ever had abortion rights from 73 to 79. And then, of course, 80 is Reagan getting elected, which is the beginning of all the problems we have today. And then 81 is AIDS. So the gay press were the only place that covered AIDS. And the straight press notoriously avoided it or misrepresented it. When they did finally start covering it, they came in with false dichotomies like innocent victims and guilty victims, and they just did a lot of harm. Now, in the first 5 years of the AIDS crisis, 40,000 people died in this country. The government did absolutely nothing. Pharma did nothing. What they did was they had patents on failed cancer drugs that they were trying to recycle. And they were looking for a pill that you would take that would make your AIDS go away because that was the biggest market share. People with AIDS had really different needs because AIDS is an umbrella term like cancer. It's different in each person. It means that your immune system is breaking down, and that would manifest differently. So people would get these horrible symptoms, dementia and blindness and skin cancer and inability to process nutrition, and the nerves in their legs would swell up. For those of you who remember, an AIDS death is a terrible, terrible death. So people with AIDS wanted treatments for these opportunistic infections, but pharma didn't want to do that because it was a smaller market share. So in the first 5 years, nothing was happening. What the gay community did was really try to respond to familial homophobia in a sense, which I believe is a great force of history that has been underestimated, because many people with AIDS had no networks, support networks. So when you look at the first 5 years of the gay community's response, it's like trying to create a facsimile of social services. So for example, Gay Men's Health Crisis, a Puerto Rican social worker named Diego Lopez started something called the Buddy Program, where you would volunteer, you'd be assigned to a person with AIDS, and you'd hang out with them or help them do their laundry until they died, basically. There was a group that would walk your dog so you could keep your pets. There was God's Love We Deliver that brought home-cooked meals for free to people. But that's really what the gay community was doing. Now, interestingly, because of the time that we're in now with the Supreme Court, in '86, this all changed with Bowers v. Hardwick, which was a Supreme Court decision that in the middle of a mass death experience upheld sodomy laws and just without permits. And this is when the response to AIDS really started to become much more politicized. So right before ACT UP was founded in March of 1987, you see some little actions happening. The silencing concentration camp uniforms and disrupted a meeting of the CDC. But it really all starts in March when Larry Kramer gives a speech at the center, and people in the audience decide that they want to start a new organization, and they agree to meet a few days later, and they form ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Now, in the 6 years that I cover in my book, which is '87 to '93, ACT UP's victories were phenomenal. I mean, it is hard to find a social movement that was as effective as ACT UP. And that's why my book is not about nostalgia. It really has been, Jim Hubbard and I interviewed 188 surviving members of ACT UP over 18 years. And we cohered an understanding of what the strategies actually were, what the timeline was, what the tactics were, and which ones worked and why, and which ones didn't. And the goal of the book was so that people today, because of course every community is under attack in this country right now, can have information about what worked and what didn't. It's not a blueprint, but it's important information. And it's very hard to get information about social movements because the mass media misrepresents them. The precursor book that really influenced me is by Taylor Branch. It's called Analysis of the Strategies of the Civil Rights Movement. But in order to get that information, it takes a long time. So let me just tell you what ACT UP's accomplished and then how I think they did it, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So their basic Capitol, the White House or the Capitol. And David Barr, who was one of the leaders of ACT UP, had this idea that instead of going to symbolic places, we should go to actual places. And the FDA was the actual problem. So ACT UP organized an action in their weird little Rockville, Maryland headquarters in this weird suburb. But by that time, there were other ACT UP chapters around the country. And it was ACT UP's first national action. And the media strategy was thought of by our dear late friend Urvashi Bad. She had a brilliant insight, which was to match up. So first of all, they got the national press to come by lying. They told them that this demonstration was going to be bigger than the anti-war march on the Pentagon. They knew it wasn't true. So then the whole national press came, and Urvashi's brilliant idea was, we have footage of Mike Signorelli, who ran the media committee, saying, "Person with AIDS from Cincinnati, over here." And he would match them with the reporter from Cincinnati. "Person with AIDS from Dallas." And so the next day there were front page stories in each city about the local person. And that really started to change the national coverage. And the FDA did, almost a week later, give in to parallel track. So that was one of the huge victories. One of the most enormous victories of ACT UP was a 4-year campaign aimed at the CDC and Social Security to get women with AIDS into trials and benefits. And let me give you a little bit of background on that. In the 60s, there was a drug called thalidomide that was given to pregnant women, and many women gave birth to children without limbs. They sued pharma, and they were paid out hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements. So pharma's response was no more women in experimental drug trials. Women were literally banned from experimental drug trials. And in the age of AIDS, there were no treatments. So if you couldn't get in a trial, you couldn't get treatment. And women with AIDS tended to be poorer, tended to be diagnosed when they were more advanced in the disease, and getting into those treatments was essential. The other thing was that women couldn't get benefits because the symptoms that you had to have to qualify for benefits were based on gay men, and women had different symptoms, and they could never get benefits. So women would literally die of AIDS without getting a diagnosis. And this campaign's slogan was, "Women don't get AIDS, they just die from it." So Terry McGovern, who was a 29-year-old poverty lawyer, sued Social Security, and ACT UP ran this campaign for 4 years and won. And it was truly the biggest victory for women and people of color in the history of HIV, and one of the very rare examples in history of a white male organization winning a huge victory for women and people of color and poor people. ACT UP created needle exchange in New York City. At this time, there wasn't the big theory around addiction was abstinence. And the concept of harm reduction was just being born and was considered a very radical idea. David Dinkins was the mayor. The black community did not support harm reduction at the time. And so it was sort of a renegade position. And former and active drug users inside ACT UP did this very high-risk strategy where they illegally exchanged needles so that they would get arrested, so that they could do a test case. And this happened, and it's so interesting because I have a photo in my book of the defendants. It's a white straight woman, a white trans woman, a black gay man, and a lesbian lawyer, this photo. This could have become the emblematic image of ACT UP, but it did not. And they won, and they made needle exchange legal in New York City. ACT UP took on the Catholic Church. This was a time before the priest-sex scandal, when the Catholic Church was incredibly powerful in New York. The cardinal was more powerful than the mayor, and he was in office longer. And usually they stayed in their lane with the Catholic schools, but when the issue came up about distributing condoms in public schools, they started to get on the public school boards to stop it. And ACT UP had this moment where they were just like, we cannot just say, oh, you're a religion, when actually you're a political organization. So now this is interesting because ACT UP was mostly Jewish and Catholic, but this is pre-gentrification New York, there was a small Protestant group, and they were afraid of ACT UP being seen as anti-Catholic. The Jews and the Catholics did not care about that. Right? So the plan was to go in and do a silent die-in during the homily. So we all went in, I went in, but one of the people in ACT UP, Michael Petrellis, decided to jump on the pew and start screaming at Cardinal O'Connor in his New Jersey accent, stop it, you're killing us, stop it. And there's total chaos, and the police and whistles and people screaming, and 100 people were arrested. And when I staggered out of there, I thought, oh no, this is so terrible, because we all agreed to do this one thing, and we did this other thing. Anyway, it turned out to be the best thing we ever did. And it was on the front page of every newspaper around the world. Homosexuals with AIDS disrupt Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. And it really changed the media coverage. And this is so interesting. I interviewed a photojournalist named Donna Binder, who said that before Stop the Church, the only photos that anybody wanted in the mainstream media were emaciated people with AIDS dying. And after Stop the Church, they wanted people with AIDS fighting for their lives. And this really changed the image of how people with AIDS and queer people were seen all over the world, and therefore how we felt about ourselves. So I think overall ACT UP changed the way that we understand ourselves and that the world understood us. And these are very significant victories. Now I just want to take a little time to explain how I think they did this. And I also want to say ACT UP never theorized itself. There was no timeline when Jim Hubbard and I started doing this. And when we started interviewing people, we found out that we, like everyone else, just thought that what we and our friends did was ACT UP, because there was no internet. So the only way you knew any information was if you went into a room and somebody told you. And if you happened to not be in the room, you wouldn't know. So there was so much going on that even I didn't even know about, and nobody knew what anybody else was doing. And we had to get a big picture of what the organizational structure was, what all the campaigns were, and that's probably why the book is 800 pages. But then I think the number one reason that they were successful is because ACT UP was not a consensus-based movement. You did not have to agree in order to go forward. It had a bottom line, it had a one-sentence statement of unity, direct action to end the AIDS crisis, and that was direct action as opposed to social service provision. But if you were going to do a direct action to end the AIDS crisis, basically you could do it. And if somebody proposed something and we disagreed with it, we would fight and we screamed at each other. And in our 60s and 70s, we are still screaming at each other. But in the end, if you wanted to do something and I didn't agree with it, I just wouldn't do it. I wouldn't try to stop you from doing it. And because of this, which no one ever decided to do it this way, it just was organically this way. I could just go do my thing with my people. So there was this huge range of action taking place at all different kinds of levels, with all kinds of strategies, with all kinds of aesthetics, in all different social milieu. And I think it was this simultaneity of response is really what made ACT UP effective, because it had internal democracy. It was a radical democracy. And I think this is our great lesson for today, that if we want is Big Tent politics. You work with people when you agree with them, and when you don't agree with them, you don't cooperate on their project. But you're not trying to force everybody to think the same way. And historically, movements that try to force homogeneity or try to force one strategy have all failed. And I have said that in public like 200 and something times, and no one has said, no, in this place in 19, no one has said, no, there is an example where that's not true. I don't think there is. Because people can only be where they're at. And that's like one of the hardest things in life to accept. And it took me 25 years of therapy to accept that people can only be where they're at. But real leadership helps people be effective where they're at. And, radical democratic structures enable all this kind of difference. So that was one thing. Second thing was that ACT UP had no theory whatsoever. People with AIDS were the experts, and people with AIDS, the needs of people with AIDS determined the agenda. And they needed concrete things. So we had to get those things in an effective way. If we had been debating theory, we never would have gotten those things. Now, Maxine Wolf, who was one of the leaders of ACT UP, pointed out that when you go action first, your theory will emerge, because you have to make decisions about how to do your action. And when you make those decisions, that's how you understand what your values are. So a lot of ideas came out of it, but there was none of this empty polarization about analysis. And finally, one of the things that I think really helped ACT UP a lot is it was primarily a gay white male organization, but there was significant participation by Latinos, because this is a period of fascist dictatorships in Chile and Argentina, and there were quite a few people in exile, and also people who had come from the student movement in Mexico City. There also was a group of women who came out of Bedford Hills Prison and came to ACT UP. So there were between 37 and 43 Latinos that I can count in ACT UP who were more politically sophisticated than the younger men. The older men had been in gay liberation, but many of the younger men had never been politically active before. And then there were these lesbians who had come out of the feminist movement, who had a lot of experience from the feminist women's health movement, the women's peace movement, and principally reproductive rights. Because reproductive rights was a multi-issue movement, and ACT UP was a multi-issue movement, and they really facilitated. So in my book, I say the names of the people, which movements they came from, and which strategies they brought with them to ACT UP, like nonviolent civil disobedience training, Jamie Bauer from the Women's Peace Movement, or patient-centered politics, Marion Bonzoff from the Feminist Women's Health Movement. And these were foundational ideas. So when it came time for these minorities to do their agendas, they very wisely never tried to stop the action to demand consciousness raising on sexism or racism. Instead, they kept their eye on the prize and marshaled the ample resources of the larger organization. So for example, ACT UP did an art auction that raised $650,000. So when women with AIDS needed to travel to testify at a hearing, and they needed to stay in hotels, they didn't have to raise the money. They could go to fundraising and get the money. When the Latino caucus realized that people with AIDS in Puerto Rico had no support, they went to fundraising and got the money and went to Puerto Rico and started ACT UP Puerto Rico. So people were very practical, and I think we have a lot to learn from that. So that's sort of my big picture about the book, and I'm very interested to hear your disagreements, questions, or just whatever you would like to contribute. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions or comments?
You said that there was the turning point of that incident at St. Patrick's Cathedral. We got to challenge the church, and then the media switched. How was that mindset? Was it because it was in a big public-private institution, or did the media look at it differently, or what?
It was so bold. I mean, people with AIDS were despised, and the Catholic Church had all the power. And in the past, people would picket outside. There was a group, Dignity, Gay Catholic Organization, and they would have pickets. But to go inside and disrupt Mass, this was so bold, and the assertion that the lives of people with AIDS were important enough to do this just blew everybody away. And as Larry Kramer says, they became afraid of us after that. Hey, hi.
Actually, Sarah, so as you know, I taught a history of AIDS class for several years.
Like, I can't
And
hear you.
Louder.
Can you stand up?
Oh, sure. So I taught a history of AIDS class for several years, and at Central Connecticut State University, and I would show Stop the Church footage from that. And the first time I taught it, I was a little bit anxious because I said there's going to be some kid who says, well, that was going too far. Not in 4 years did anyone ever say that to me. In fact, the students said they should have gone farther. They should have stormed the altar. So times have changed a little bit, but I agree, that was the moment. I was not at that movement. I was not at that action, but it changed me at that point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I teach LGBTQ history and
Oh, where do you teach?
Florida State
Okay.
University.
Oh, okay.
Yes, absolutely.
That's you.
Front line. Yeah.
And one of the things that I like to do is give sample chapters from a range of different books. And so we'll read 2 or 3 different chapters out of different books, like say on the AIDS crisis or a topic. And I'm wondering if you could help me out here. If you had to pick one chapter out of your book, where you think compared to the other historiography, what you would most like to emphasize about yours, which chapter would it be?
Well, the one that I have that no one has is Women Don't Get AIDS, They Just Die From It, because all the other histories completely ignored women with AIDS. And it was so significant because, actives, by breaking down the exclusion of women from trials, it means that today, every woman with HIV in the world who takes a drug is taking something that was tested on women. So it's actually one of the longest reaching successes of the organization. You can also show them our film United in Anger that was made by Jim Hubbard, and you can get it for free on Canopy, and that's sort of an overview of ACT UP. Yes.
So, I remember ACT UP very well, and I remember these shocking, bold actions that would happen, and ACT UP just sort of exploded. But I also remember the sort of gay establishment, we shouldn't be doing this. This is going to hurt us. Blah blah blah. I mean, can you talk about that sort of tension between?
Well, my view is that the further to the left is, the more credibility the center has. And if you don't have a left, the left moves to the right. So the center has much less freedom. So actually, strategically, people should want there to be a left flank.
Right.
I mean, that's how gay marriage happened, because ACT UP was so extreme. I don't know how old you are, but if you remember before that, I think you're younger than me, gay marriage was considered crazy.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, it's considered so extreme. But then when ACT UP went into St. Patrick's Cathedral, it became a very reasonable demand.
Interesting.
Also, we had talked earlier about Barney Frank, and I promised you an ACT UP
yes.
story.
Right.
Great.
So, ACT UP felt that they were infiltrated by the police. And as a result, when they were going to do illegal actions, they wouldn't discuss it on the floor at the Monday night meeting. There was an alternative structure of affinity groups, which would be like 10 to 15 people who would meet in someone's apartment, and they would plan illegal actions. But ACT UP we all trusted each other so much. Sometimes just by being there, you got trusted, that ACT UP would provide legal representation for those people, even though their actions were not approved of by the floor. And I always wondered, was this paranoid? Well, when I got all the Freedom of Information Act information, it turned out ACT UP was profoundly infiltrated. I mean, almost everything is redacted, and it was so infiltrated and so redacted that even I, who know a lot about ACT UP, I couldn't figure out who the people were. At one point, Barney Frank wrote to the FBI, this was in the 90s, and said, okay, who are these people? Are these your people who are pretending to be ACT UP people? Or are these ACT UP people who got arrested for drugs or something and are giving information? And the answer from the FBI, I put both letters in the back, is very vague. Like they did not answer. But it's a very astute question.
Yes.
Because, you know, in those days you get arrested for anything. Yeah. Like now.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering about direct action movements and like the longevity of direct action movements and how powerful they can be, but then also it seems like they usually have a sort of beginning, middle, and end, and the end can often be painful. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Is that the nature of what they're trying to do, or what are your thoughts
I just
about
think movements can't last forever. You know, and you have to know when to get out. And a lot of it depends on the zeitgeist. You can't force it, unfortunately. You know, just like, it just has to be that magical moment where people are so fed up that they're willing to take more risks.
Yeah, they're dying.
Yeah.
They didn't have a choice. They were dying.
Yes, but most people with AIDS never were in ACT UP, and there were plenty of people who died even in the closet, right? It was a certain kind of person. This was one of my big questions when I started interviewing people. Who were these people? What did they have in common? And I had I was wrong for many years. Because first I thought, maybe they all grew up with families that were community oriented. So my earliest interviews, I'm asking people like, were your parents in the PTA? Were they active in their church? I couldn't find anything. Then we thought maybe it was experiences with AIDS, but it wasn't true. There were people who came to ACT UP who did not know a single person with AIDS. And then in year 8, I met this girl who was an actress. Her name was Rebecca Cole. And she'd been working in a bar, and someone said, oh, you want to make $10 an hour? They're starting an AIDS hotline. So she needed the $10 an hour. So she was on the hotline, but there was nothing to tell anybody. So people would call and say, like, can I get AIDS from a hamburger? And, you know, she didn't know anything. And then one day this woman called her and said, I'm a woman with AIDS in Connecticut, and I was turned away from an experimental drug trial because they said they're not taking women. And Rebecca thought that was crazy. So she started just calling all these trials and found out that they were all excluding women. So she called the CDC, made an appointment, went and saw them, and this is the beginning of the solidarity with women with HIV movement. And I was like, okay, now I get it. It's not based on experience, it's characterological. This is the kind of person who cannot stand by and be a bystander. And that's what these people have in common. There weren't many of them. You know, the largest
I was involved with that ACT UP with 120 other people on Wall Street one morning when they just shut down tried to shut down the stock exchange. And well, we went to jail, but we were all released, and then we had death tickets. But it was quite powerful.
You should watch United in Anger because we have footage of that demonstration. You might find yourself in there. I mean, I interviewed the lawyers. You know, nobody was paid in ACT UP, and there were many lawyers. And one lawyer, Lori Cohen, said she did 10,000 cases herself. Wow. So I don't know really how many arrests there were, but there were many.
On that day or in general?
In over that 6-year period.
How many times have you been arrested?
Me personally?
Yeah.
I was arrested for fair beating.
Oh,
Yes.
For what?
what?
Fair beating. It's when the line for get a token is too long and you go over your I was arrested for disruption of Congress on the Human Life Statute in 1982 for yelling, a woman's life is a human life. I was arrested on St. Patrick's Day for trying to march with Irish lesbians and gays. And I was arrested at Day of Desperation for ACT UP in Grand Central Station and at Trumpsgiving at Trump Plaza. Yeah. Any other? Yes.
I don't really have a question, but just a comment to go with this person, what they said about teaching same. I didn't know how it's going to go with my students to teach about the AIDS epidemic in ACT UP particular. And I'm surprised there's that little footage of you after St. Patrick's where you're kind of like, I don't know if that was the greatest idea. Like, you were pretty upset. And so, I have a lot of Catholic Latina students, and no, too, all of them like should have gone further.
Wow.
Totally appropriate. Should have done, and so I was really struck by that. But I'll also say that in my class, people who are 21 right now are not doing that well, and surprisingly, as hard as it is for them to learn about some parts of the AIDS epidemic, ACTIV is so inspiring to them. Like you said, the idea that we could do something that's effective, okay, and that there are ways to learn how to do something effective. So I'm really excited about your book. Maybe I'll be able to find a chunk of it that they can read. And
Yeah,
learn
I mean,
more
it's
about
it's
that.
good to pair it with Martin Luther King's 1964 letter from Birmingham jail, where he lays out his idea of how direct action should be. Exactly what ACTIV did, although we didn't know it.
Yeah.
And so, different communities have figured out the order of events, which is you become the expert on the issue. You design the solution. Your solution should be reasonable, winnable, and doable. You present it to the powers that be. When they say no, you do direct action to communicate through the media to the public that you have the solution. And that's how you pressure institutions. And that's how he worked, and that's how ACTIV works. Yes.
About the St. Patrick's incident, you mentioned how it was a turning point for media representation of gay people with AIDS. Did it have how did the church respond? Did they move at all, or?
Well, condom distribution was not stopped in the public schools.
Is that over there?
The victory.
Can I just, since we're talking about St. Patrick's, I remember it so vividly. I was a gay activist from San Francisco. I worked with Harvey Milk and all the way back, and I was living in New York and wanting to get more involved. And the St. Patrick's thing happened, and I was raised a Catholic and Irish, and it was someone stepped on the Eucharist. Like,
Not exactly what happened.
well,
Yes.
that was in the paper, or
Right.
and I just like freaked out. And I think it took me like 6 months to go to an ACT UP meeting at that point. I was like,
I mean, the real
Which I
story
became
is
very
in
involved,
there. His
but-
name was Tom Keene, and but it wasn't for everybody. And that's the thing. In these movements, you have to find out the place that's right for you. I mean, somebody had to cook those meals that went to homebound people with AIDS, right? And that's why pushing everyone into one strategy doesn't make any sense. People just need to figure out where they belong, and then that's how you get all this kind of simultaneity of action. And that's how you get a paradigm shift. Yeah.
While you were compiling all your information, did you maybe get any hope for things going on now, or?
So there's a lot more going on than we realize. And, every city has people who are doing stuff. It's just not reported anywhere. We don't have, there used to be this American newspaper called The Guardian, which was a Marxist weekly that was 100 years old. And every week you could buy it in New York, and it would tell you what the actions were in every city. And we don't have any way of getting that information now. But there are people who are in movements against police violence, for example, in every city. And they're all using different strategies, and there are leaders, and we don't know who they are, but there's a lot going on. In terms of the queer movement, in those days, there was an autonomous gay and lesbian movement because the left didn't want us. So the Communist Party had expelled gay people, the civil rights movement had famously sidelined Bayard Rustin, and the feminist movement had a number of lesbian purges which haven't even been historicized. But now, if you look at the most radical movements, the anti-eviction movement, immigration reform, movement for Black Lives, movement against police violence, Palestine solidarity, all of these movements have queer and trans people in leadership. So it's like radical queer politics is now inside these movements. And then there's that rarefied sort of HRC thing, which is separate from that. And I don't even know where they are. All the things that have been going down, Don't Say Gay, and all the shit that's happening, where are these gay, highly funded organizations? I don't even know who the leaders are, and I don't hear much from them. I do know that like Lambda is doing, and GLAD, the legal organizations are very, very busy, and the ACLU is incredible. But there's a real split between gay rights and this more like radical queer politics. Okay, anything else?
Did you happen to see that wonderful documentary about Peter Tatchell? And I can't ask you about it then, did you?
No, I haven't seen it. Should you recommend it?
Yeah, and of course the question is, did he go too far? Or was he right to do the things that he did, some of which were
Yeah, but I think that we need those kind of people because we need to have the discussions and see what's possible. So, yes. Hi.
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges right now with all the anti-queer bills, especially in schools being at the forefront, is that so many organizations have not taken on youth issues in general and schools in specifically. So it's not surprising that it's the legal organizations and ACLU that have already been doing this that are the ones that you see busy now. I know a young trans woman who just did the movement this year for the action for the walkout in schools, and as much as you could tell, there were like at least 19 states involved, and it was really interesting to see because, you know, she came out of being part of a Gender and Sexuality Alliance in school and funded and supported from the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed. So it was like, I saw the challenge in schools where you had change agents and activists and a lot of supportive adults in schools being like, well, how do these young people want to have a direct action, you know, where they're leaving the school day, like breaking rules, and you have the administrators and school people wanting to support them in some way. And I think that what you said about all these groups having a role to play and just finding out where it is, I just saw all those like kind of different groups playing a part there. And it's interesting to know like I loved when you just kind of just broke down just what the different steps were, and using the letter from Birmingham Jail as the guide there, and also regarding like what the specific easy ask would be that really could make a difference when lives really still are, I mean, lives are clearly at stake for young queer people.
Yeah, the ask has to be winnable because people need victories. And if it's too abstract, then you will dissipate people's energies. All right, thank you all so much.
Sarah, before you go, I just wanted to ask you two quick things. Okay, so one, I'll ask both questions. The first is, now that after several year delay, the Lady Hamlet has concluded its successful run, do you have a couple thoughts about that? And the second question is, are you able to say anything, or do you want to say anything about this very exciting Marianne Faithfull project?
Okay, so Lady Hamlet was a huge, fun success. I loved it. I had an incredible experience here at Provincetown Theater. And I don't know if it has a future, but I hope so, but we'll see. I don't really have an apparatus, so we'll see what happens. And I've been working with Marianne Faithfull now for 5 years to try to do a musical based on her catalog. And she's not well right now, but we do have a first draft, and Jeff here has organized a workshop for the spring to help develop it, and thank you, Jeff. So we'll see what happens, and David and I are committed to doing another play here next summer. So very excited. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank